Die Atomnation Nummer 1 ist zweifelsohne Frankreich. Fast 80% des elektrischen Stroms wird in den fast 60 Atomreaktoren des Landes produziert. Weltweit hat Frankreich damit eine Dichte an Atomreaktoren, die wohl beispiellos ist. Kann die Atomnation Nummer 1 aus der Atomkraft aussteigen? Eine spannende Frage an Yves Marignac. Yves Marignac, s'il vous plaît. S'il vous plaît, Yves Marignac, s'il vous plaît. Den darf ich jetzt nämlich bitten auf die Bühne. Yves Marignac ist Direktor von WISE Paris. WISE steht für World Information Service on Energy und wurde gegründet 1983 aus dem Bedürfnis heraus, für unabhängige Informationen über die französische Energiepolitik zu sorgen. Yves Marignac war im Kabinett des französischen Umweltministers an der nationalen Energiedebatte 2013 beteiligt und 2012 wurde er für seine Anti-Atomarbeit mit dem Nuclear Free Future Award ausgezeichnet. Jetzt das dritte Mal. Yves, s'il vous plaît, dein Stichwort.
Okay, I hope this works. Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm going to try to talk about the status of the energy and nuclear debate in France, which has quite moved a lot in the past few years. Roland already said that, so just to mention that WISE Paris has been, since 1983, one of the very few centers of independent expertise on nuclear and energy issues in France. And myself, I've been around for almost 20 years now, and I've been involved one way or the other in most of the institutional or non-institutional debates on nuclear and energy issues in France over that period. I just want to start briefly with a few words to remind you the French nuclear and energy situation. As you know it, France has 58 reactors, which cover 80% of its electric generation. It's important to note that we have only one operator, which is still almost 85% state-owned, EDF. And that we have also Areva, which is in the bad situation that you know of. Areva is also 83% state-owned. So it's really, we can talk about a nuclear state still. Yeah, we have a very, very strong nuclear industry still. It's important to note that well, because nuclear only provides electricity, France is still almost as dependent on fossil fuel as other countries. We are more than 70% dependent on oil and gas, which are mostly imported, which means that we pay 60 to 70 billion euros every year for that. It's also important to note, I didn't put it on the slide, but this is a specific message for Darius and the Polish politicians. Please note that it's not only that we pay 60 to 70 billion euros, it's also that, as in Poland, about 10 million people are in energy poverty. So you can have 80% nuclear power and energy poverty at the same time. We also have greenhouse gas emissions, which are way too high, about 4 times higher than needed. And since 2005, there's an objective in the French law which says we must reduce fourfold by 2050 our greenhouse gas emissions. And also, there's an overall problem of aging energy infrastructures, including nuclear reactors. this is the overall situation, and now I want to focus for a while on kind of, well, energy scenario that was produced and published in 2011 by a group of experts called Negawatt, and I was the coordinator of this work. And the reason I mention it is not only because I think it's interesting in itself, of course, but I think it was very influential in what happened in the past years in the French energy debate. This scenario is a 2050 energy scenario, which is basically trying to develop on the French scale, on the scale of the French energy system, a very simple approach which goes in 3 steps. First, to be clever on energy uses, the way we use energy for real energy services, individually and collectively. We call it energy sufficiency also, although the word doesn't match as much in English what we mean in French. The second step is obviously energy efficiency, being clever on equipments, on all the energy chain from supply to end use. And the third step is to be clever on energy resources, which means for us step from stock-based energy, fossil and nuclear, to flow-based energy, meaning renewables. When you develop this approach with the 2050 vision for the French overall energy system, not only electricity, but all energy uses, this is what it leads to. First of all, 2/3 reduction of primary energy consumption, thanks to sufficiency, efficiency on the supply side, and efficiency on the demand side. And then for the rest of it, I mean, the energy that still is needed to provide energy services, we think that at least 93% of it could be based on local renewable energy. On top of that, when you do this, you get a 16-fold reduction of energy-related CO2 emissions. This scenario also goes with nuclear phase-out. I mean, it's very clear from the beginning that it's not a nuclear phase-out scenario. It's an energy transition scenario, and as part of it, we don't replace existing reactors. One rule that we really kept in mind was not to extend any reactor's lifetime over 40 years. This plus not starting the EPR being currently built, plus adapting to the pace of development of renewables and energy demand leads to total final nuclear phase-out in 20 years' time, starting in 1211, so by 2033. So this scenario, as I said, has been quite influential, and this is, unfortunately, I should say, thanks to the impact of the Fukushima catastrophe on the French nuclear and energy debate, which saw a lot of French politicians moving in their position on nuclear issues. And, well, it was quite a long process, but in the run-up to last presidential elections, which were held in 2012, many politicians started to talk about nuclear phase-out or reducing the share of nuclear, and especially Hollande came with this objective of reducing the nuclear share from 75% to 50% by 2025. On top of this quantitative objective, it's important to note that he made a very significant symbolic step, which is that before him, all French presidents referred to nuclear power as a mean to get energy independency in France. And Hollande said that's not the right way to look at it. The right way is that we should reduce both our dependency on oil and our dependency on nuclear power. And this is really a very important new mindset for all the political debate in France. Then Hollande won the election, kept to his commitment, and we had a very important national and decentralized debate in 2012-2013 on the energy transition project. And during that time, I was a member of the General Secretary within the cabinet of the Minister of Environment to work on the issues and to prepare and implement this debate. And the debate led to a draft bill, which was eventually presented last year in July, and which is still being discussed in the Parliament in its very, very last end, and should be passed in the next weeks. And I'm going to tell you in a few minutes a little more about what we expect, what we are almost sure now, to find in that very important bill. Before that, I want just to focus on one part of this overall energy transition debate, which is the discussion that we had, held by a pluralist group of experts, on the comparison of different existing scenarios and what they tell us on energy policy's priorities. So this is quite complex, but the important thing is that the experts told us there are two main families of scenarios on the table, energy transition scenarios. The first family goes for energy reduction, but not that much, say 20% in final energy reduction by 2050, and bets a lot more on low carbon supply. The second family of scenario goes for much higher energy reduction, 50% in final energy consumption, and also implements, of course, low carbon supply. And then, in each of the families, you have different choices, whether it be a mix of renewables and nuclear, or a preference for nuclear, or a preference for renewables. And you can see on the right hand the negawatt scenario, which is low demand renewables priority. The main finding of the comparison is that if you look for overall greenhouse gases emissions, which means not only those related to energy, but also those from agriculture and so on, you need much more than fourfold reduction in the energy sector to meet a fourfold objective for overall greenhouse gases emissions. And that means that only the scenarios on the right, meaning with 50% reduction of demand, are compatible with meeting a fourfold reduction objective for overall greenhouse gas emissions. On top of that, there was a rough economic comparison on comparing the investments on one hand and the savings on the French energy bill on the other hand, which show that the best scenarios from a climate perspective are also the best one in the long term from an economic perspective, those who provide the more savings. This was a very important discussion because it led, when it comes to the objectives that will be in the law when it passes, to this very important objective in the right, which really creates a long-term framework of 50% reduction of final energy consumption by 2050. This is going to be in French law in a few weeks' time. And the other important objective that is still in the law, although there was a lot of discussion about it, is this, on the bottom, this objective of reducing the share of nuclear power in French generation to 50% by 2025. I won't discuss the other objectives, of course. They are supposed to be consistent with those two, but I think those two mid-term and long-term objectives will be really framing the next stages of French energy policy. And I might say we worked well, because it was a lot of work to get that done. Once you've said 50% by 2025, it's not a very obvious thing to implement. I just want to insist with that graph on two issues. The first one, this is assuming flat electricity consumption, which is really the most probable evolution given the trend in energy efficiency. Point C on the graph is what the 50% objective means if with a flat electricity consumption and still some electricity exports. Point A is on the curve which is drawn by if you shut down every reactor at most when it reaches 40 years lifetime. So what you see is that on one hand, reaching point C means around 20 reactors to shut down by 2025, which gives you an idea of the huge size of such a program. But still, it's not enough to prevent the need for any license extension beyond 40 years for some of the reactors. This is a kind of contradictory constraints that we are taken into. The second point, when it comes to this law and the objective, is that unfortunately there's not much about the implementation and the meaning in the long term of this 2025 objective. And it's important to underline that the main reason for this law to exist from a political point of view was that since Hollande had committed to this objective, and since this objective means that some reactors must shut down, he needed to give the government a political tool to impose reactors shut down on EDF for energy policy reasons. But when it comes to the final version of the law, there's no such tool given to the government, and this is because, in simple words, the government lost the internal battle against EDF, who didn't want anything of that kind. So the only things we have are, first, a political commitment to shut down 2 reactors, probably Fessenheim, the 2 oldest ones, by 2016. But this is in a kind of balance with the startup of Flamanville 3. The problem is that Flamanville 3 will not be ready to start by that time. And the only thing we have in the law is a cap of the existing nuclear capacity at its current level. There's nothing more, and then it goes for some energy planning by the government and some strategic plan by EDF, but in the end it's EDF who has, who keeps its hand on what's going to happen with its nuclear reactors. Another important thing is that there's going to be a new feature in the law which will force public inquiries for license extensions beyond 40 years and force, therefore, for environmental impact assessment and public participation, and obviously this is a very good evolution. This is for the implementation of this 2025 objective, so again, not much, but the other problem is that there's no clear vision of what's happening after 2025. No commitment from the government either to keep on reducing the share of nuclear power or to maintain it, which would mean new reactors. They really don't want to put any new reactors on the table for political reasons, but they still voluntarily unclear on what's next. And my 2 final slides will be about the perspectives on what could be next, with some of the discussions which are going on in France. One on what's happening with the existing reactors, and the other one is what could happen with renewables. So the first one is about what's happening with these existing reactors. Since 2008, EDF changed its strategy from building new reactors, and the EPR in Flamanville 3 was initially bound to prepare, to anticipate for the need of building new reactors and prepare for that. But since 2008, EDF prefers life extension of its existing reactors. But EDF claims it would cost 55 billion euros. The Court of Accounts looked into it, and also a parliamentary inquiry commission last year, and their finding is that based on EDF's assumption and EDF's costs, it would cost at least 110 billion euros. Both safety reinforcements after Fukushima and upgrading and preparing for life extension. I did a report for Greenpeace France last year, which discusses the options and shows that if you really want to make existing reactors as safe as possible and as close as possible of the safety level of generation 3 reactors, the overall cost could even be double of that. But the main conclusion is that in any case, whatever EDF wants to, they are not in industrial, especially given Areva's situation, they are not in industrial and financial capacity to cope with life extension of all their reactors. So whatever they want, they will have to shut down some of the reactors, at least for economic reasons. And obviously, replacing existing reactors with EPRs would be even more complicated and more expensive. That's the good news on the nuclear side, but there are also good news on the renewable side with an official study by the French Agency on Energy Conservation, for Energy Conservation and Renewables, which published a study last month. I mean, there was a kind of scandal that the government tried to postpone the publication, but then it leaked, and then the agency eventually published it. What the study shows is that if you look into our electric needs in 2050 and try to match them with renewables, first, there's no technical problem. There are different ways to match this demand with different mixes of 100% renewable supply, even taking into account, of course, the security of the grid. And on top of that, it's not more expensive than keeping 50% of nuclear power in the mix. So this is a very important study because it changes the perspective for discussing nuclear issues from, you know, the current trend, which is that whatever we do in the long term, shifting from nuclear in the short term is complicated, and keeping the reactors is probably the most simple thing to do. From a long-term perspective, where as was shown from the German example this morning, I mean, we have to think of an electricity system without any base load, which is possible by 2050, and then we really have to wonder whether France wants to keep some nuclear reactors in that perspective. So that's it for my presentation. I really thank you for your attention. I'm ready for questions if we have time. And I just want to stress one last thing. Roland, you told me about, you know, your will that this leads to more cooperation. We are still working on energy scenarios with this negawatt group, and we really want to develop some cooperation on, you know, comparison of regional scenarios. We have started a work which looks into scenarios in Denmark, Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. Therefore, I would be very happy to, you know, for any contacts for discussion with people working on energy scenarios in those countries or also other countries. Thank you very much.